The Ames City Council for December 4th to order. And we have one item on the agenda this evening, Ames 2040 update. And Kelly, I'll turn it over to you and then you can go from there.
Oh, next one? That one.
All right. So we're going to have 4 topics tonight. Really quickly, just kind of give you a progress. What have we been doing for 3 months since September? The meat of the project is going to be talking about RDG is going to be talking about the land use principles and vision. And this is an introduction. Obviously, you're not taking action tonight. This is to make sure that, again, we're going in the direction that we think we're supposed to be headed with you. And they're also going to introduce the infill demonstrations. So that was a separate task from the external growth. And you had less direction from them as more of an exploratory exercise. So RDG is going to walk through different ideas there and see how you react to that. And then we'll decide what we're going to go from there. And then really quickly at the end, talk about the next few months, again, about what next steps are going to be happening. So you're informed. And especially if you recall, you have another special meeting December 19th, and that's going to be a critically important one. That is the night we will be delivering the final work on the scenarios evaluations so that you can have the quantitative and the qualitative information to give us direction how to proceed for the preferred land use concepts. So as we see up here in September, was the last time we met. We asked for some direction on the structure of the plan. You gave us direction about looking at the Champaign, Illinois as a model for that. We also talked about kind of framing the growth scenarios and breaking them into tiers to understand kind of what's buildable sooner rather than later. We'll talk just briefly about that tonight, but that's really about what December 19th is going to be focused on. And then we also had you endorse kind of the priority of topics, and that's what leads into those next months. We're obviously not in October right now. We're in December. We got delayed in the scenarios tasks, trying to get the data as accurate as possible. We had to do a lot of work with city staff on getting our models up to date for traffic, water, and sewer. And there was just more to it than we thought. So that's why we're here tonight instead of a month ago on getting that done. But I think we're getting really comfortable with what we're going to be able to present in 2 weeks and be able to move off the scenarios task. So that's where we've been. Any questions about kind of where we are in relation to the September update that we gave you? And again, at the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about those next steps, which is moving into January, February, and March to talk about the other topics that were described in September.
Can you share with council who you have interacted with since September and what kind of feedback you're getting? I know one of the things that we talked about was engaging the school district in conversation, because these are going to really affect the school district in particular. And also, has there been any kind of conversation or touching base with the county at all on this?
So so since September, so let's include, I think it's all probably been since September. So we have met with 3 of the 4 school districts. We will keep reaching out to the Gilbert School District, but we have not been able to connect on meeting with them. We've met with Ames, Nevada, and United. We've also reached out to both Xenia Rural Water and Central Iowa Water to get an understanding of how they view these areas. Most of the growth that's shown is not in serviceable Ames, or it's in serviceable Ames area, it's just not in our territory. And what is that going to mean for us going forward? We don't have concrete responses, of course, back on that, but we'll talk about what that means at the next meeting. And then we also did have a meeting with Story County Planning Director to kind of walk through a lot of what the scenarios are. How does that work with the county's comprehensive plan? They've done some other analysis for different things in the north area in the past. And we also had some comments from, not just from the planning department. I'm forgetting the name of the department, but the Parks Open Space Conservation Division also gave us some feedback as well about some of the resources around the city. So those are kind of been the groups that we've sought out to specifically respond to issues related to the directional growth. And that's what we've been doing besides working internally on the actual information.
Kelly, would it make sense to also reach out to Boone County because that's?
Oh, we have met with Boone County also.
Okay, thanks.
So I met with the Boone County, I think there's titles, the zoning administrator. And so we'll give you a little sense of that as we talk about this on the 19th. But those are the main groups that we've been reaching out to, kind of those governmental entities that would be involved in any future growth and annexation.
Great, thanks.
So how will the feedback that you're getting back from them come back to council, and how will that affect the decision? Because I know in talking with some of the school board members, they're anticipating now that it's possible that when they open the high school, they'll actually be at capacity already. And Gilbert is also concerned about, enrollment. So whatever we're going could affect our partners. And so I think I'm saying that they have to control the direction, but I think we need to have an informed decision, make sure.
Yeah, so I think
conversation.
I didn't really come prepared to go through that tonight, but
You will in the.
I will, but just to give you an early glimpse, when you're talking about 20-year plans, these agencies don't respond in that kind of planning model. So not that they're not interested, but they don't make decisions about facilities until there's a reason to build the facility. So that's kind of the gist of what I've heard from everyone is thank you for involving us. We might be doing capacity planning next year. So if you're telling me that I have more area to think about, I will work that into my assessment, but they're not reacting right now. And what I've also said is, hey, this is an introduction. I can't tell you that we're going into the United area yet or not. But when the city does make a decision about the comp plan, that's when we need to start talking about implementation and forging a stronger relationship with me, keeping you aware of what's happening and how you want to look at these things and be involved in the development process. So they understood it was kind of more of an introduction now. And if the plan is adopted and it shows those areas, then we would have to have implementation measures about involvement, basically, and how they would need to deal with that.
Although an interesting thing about the way that this plan is going together is that it has somewhat interchangeable parts. So if the market moves off in one direction, it can accommodate that without getting blown out of the water, which then has an impact on the decisions that schools make in the long run. So
I think in general, much like most infrastructure, there's not a lot of empty seats in schools. There's not a lot of empty pipe capacity. There's not a lot of empty road capacity. So saying one is not available now is probably not the right approach for thinking 20 years out.
Yeah.
I think that's the essence of what we're doing at this point.
I might add one other thing that we did is that we posted the development concept online where people can drop pin drops and provide comments. And so we've had over 300 comments so far.
So that's been an interactive.
That's really good.
That's been the interactive tool. We put that up in August when we had a workshop in August to let people come in and see the infill exercises and ask more questions about scenarios. So that just predated the September meeting, but that's been available now for a couple months. Okay. Any other questions on our work progress from the last couple of months? Okay. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to RDG, and they're going to present almost all the material tonight. And I think they said that it's kind of two different things. Again, we're talking about land use principles first, And then the explanation about the infill demonstration is kind of a separate thing again. And so we were estimating, depending on the inquisitiveness of the council, that is probably a 2-hour session to reasonably get through materials and respond to first level questions that you have.
So a couple of things before we get started. One is to think about tonight's presentation, first of all, not as a presentation, but as a conversation. So we really would like you to interact, which is why we're all sitting around the table. This will provide kind of a first draft of the vision and the principles of land use and transportation, which then become the framework for actions, for how those things are specifically done. So the principles are, the guiding ideas, and then the next segment down is what are the actual policies and actions that execute those ideas. You haven't seen these before, but we would like you, within the next 2 or 3 weeks to review them, see what's missing, talk about editorial changes and so forth. So they're not really finalized. We don't even like we're not sure we've got all the verbiage right, but view it as a template that you can then work from, see what needs to be added, whether they represent a reasonable consensus about what we've heard from the community.
So how do you want council to give you feedback, and what's the timeline so we meet with your criteria?
This evening, we'll present these principles that will engender some conversation.
Right.
But if you within the next couple of weeks had some ideas or revisions or that for the 19th meeting, that would be great.
Well, I think
those in writing to you, Kelly.
so. I think it's a little more. I mean, I think you have more of the time than that.
Yeah, it's not a hard
To be fair to the
deadline.
council, you have 2 regular meetings in the next 8 days. I mean, and then you have the special meeting after that. You have another one also.
We got one Friday morning.
Okay. So to be fair to you guys, I know you have a lot of other content.
Okay.
So we're not making decisions on the 19th about this is the final
Yeah,
selection.
that's
So
right.
I would
Yeah.
say you have, as you get to it, it helps give you some background again for the 19th, but I think you have over a month here to start to give, and you can send direct edits or comments to us. We will deliver it back out to all the council so you can see it. And depending on how that looks, we could agendize that for discussion and get motions about what needs to go where. But right now, it's first level comments tonight. Any specific, if you have wordsmithing stuff, we don't want to get into wordsmithing. We want to say, hey, that concept's wrong. That's not right.
That's right.
Or add this or that. And if it's wordsmithing, send that to me and we'll look at that and see how meaningful that is. I'm not looking at
Please
Gloria on
looking
purpose,
directly at
Tim. I'm
me.
looking at you.
So I'm just trying to make sure we hang a date on this so you guys can keep things on. So January 10th is a Friday. Would that,
That'd be great.
That'd be great.
it's a week after obviously the
So,
holiday?
so
Would
if
that
we
be
were to
better?
get written feedback before January 10th, that would be ideal.
Mhm.
If you don't have written feedback, that's fine too. I'm just saying, don't have to get everything out tonight. It's an introductory item.
Thank you.
So January
It's helpful to
10th.
have a deadline, that way we're not going to.
Right.
You know what we're trying to do. Okay.
So moving on, land use and growth.
You have the clicker.
I have the clicker. Yeah, so vision statements obviously can be very weird if they have any meaning at all. So we're trying to come up with something that in a sentence suggests a perspective. Ames is an evolving city that as things change, that takes a balanced, environmentally sustainable approach to growth and development, balanced in terms of different types of development, different directions potentially of growth, not going, shall we say, if we were talking about political terms, to the right or to the left, but being in a zone that's inclusive, that balances different demands. So it's not all pro-development, it's not all anti-development. It's trying to find a sweet spot.
The one challenge with that, though, is that those terms can mean very different things to people. And so
Yeah,
I didn't realize we had to come up with a slogan to make this work. I mean, this is, environmentally sustainable to one person might be no growth at all. And so I guess I'm not fixed on that we even have to have such a thing. And plus, councils in the future are going to vary. And so to what degree are we going to, this is meant to be a planning document to give general guidance. I don't know. I don't want to overthink this, but I don't.
yeah, think about it, that,
So this would not be a decision-making statement.
yeah,
This is like an introduction
yeah,
to the actual more specific policies that would fulfill the vision or fulfill the goals of the city. So you would never make a decision based on a vision statement. That should not happen.
Right.
It should be and there's going to be two layers of this. You're going to see this introduced as kind of the short answers, and then there's more detail that will keep getting
Yeah,
developed
what
as
this
actual
all-
policies. And we talked a little bit just an hour ago, how much of this is about shaping the plan right now versus administering the plan in the future. And those could be two completely different
Agreed.
policies. And so right now, RDG is talking about how we shape the plan, and I'm always going to be conscious of how do I administer the plan. So that's always going to be in my thought process, and
Yeah.
we'll be working towards that
and
as we do that.
these principles could really be seen almost as a table of contents. So for example, number one, sustainable growth. Ames new growth will be both economically and environmentally sustainable. What does that mean? Well, that's the next step. So what does that mean in terms of measurement? In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, of climate action goals, and so forth. And we know that you're going through another process to develop a climate action program. So this should ultimately, those measures should really be coordinated as that gets into the process.
And one thing that we wanted to capture with that statement is council's direction is that 15,000 people population is, it's not our goal to grow by 15, but we're clearly trying to grow as a community. We think the welfare of the community involves growth. So we're trying to make sure that that's clear in these statements. It's not a no growth kind of approach. And so
Yeah.
economic sustainability of the community is part of the growth of the community. So that's why we're trying to introduce two concepts about sustainability at the same time. And it's a pretty common way to try to deal with this, to make sure it is balanced, is to not have all policies about the environment in one place and all the policies about something else on a completely different page. If anytime you can marry them up and they work together, that's going to be better for everybody, in trying to make sure that if we're doing a balanced approach, which is what we've heard, that we do that.
Right. So that's kind of number one. Number two is consent. We don't like this, exactly think that this term is right, but concentric development, that we will accommodate projected population growth on both infill and contiguous new greenfield growth areas that coordinate existing infrastructure with incremental extensions of services. So what this is implying, and that's what we'll get into a little bit later in this evening's presentation, is we could be looking at growth in all directions rather than in a single direction, that growth is going to be incremental, and it's going to be related to extensions of utilities that don't like stretch something out 2 miles and develop along a corridor, but rather involve smaller pieces. We're also implying that the market, interestingly, in Ames is different from, say, a place like Omaha, where it's always been traditionally west, or St. Louis, where it's always been traditionally west, and that it's really, and that's why the term concentric is there, that there's a market to go north, south, west, and even potentially east. So there's not any one area that you'd say, well, that's not logically where the market wants to go. So, one of the criticisms that we heard from developers was the previous land use plan proposed growth in one direction, and much of that involved Iowa State University making decisions about utilization of land that it wasn't about to make. So the idea here is to be contiguous and incremental, but not necessarily to say it will all go in one direction or another. And the process that we've gone through of basically loading all the growth into each of 4 or 5 scenarios has been really useful to us, but it's not necessarily a matter of trying to pick one out of the 5 and saying we're going to put all the eggs in that one basket. But it allows us to go farther into the structure of those, and to say that within each of those growth areas, there are different tiers that correspond to the ease of development and the cost of development for each one. So, and they're effectively incremental tiers. So growth happens contiguously, incrementally, and involves both an infill component, which we'll talk about in more detail today, and a greenfield development that's in different directions on the edge of the urbanized area. So number 3 is infill development that enhances the urban fabric, that Ames will take advantage of opportunities within the developed city to increase both the efficiency and quality of its urban environment. So again, here we're looking at areas that seem to have rich possibilities for infill, that it will show you where we think some of those are a little bit later. And that infill should both help us meet growth and density goals, and also do things that actually make life better rather than worse. So, it was interesting. I was mentioning to people, I was in Fayetteville last night, where we've done a big corridor plan, but the presentation before me was of their comprehensive plan, which they're doing in-house. And a couple of people were mentioning that infill, that word infill, has developed fairly bad connotations in Fayetteville, either because of gentrification or too high a density that the neighbors don't want to tolerate, even though the city wants to increase its density substantially. So we want to make sure that when we talk about infill, we're doing things that actually are seen as improving the environment rather than imposing on it. And then the action items and policies get into how do we ensure that that happens through land use regulation or development standards, or step downs and transition points and so forth that can, but we're not quite there yet. So number 4 gets into a little bit more detail on it's kind of restating or detailing number 2, incremental contiguous greenfield development. New development areas will be incremental to existing urbanized land, create high quality, well-connected neighborhoods, and use existing and future public investments efficiently. So this is getting into issues like where we've got a street that needs to continue, that's stubbing out into a new development area, that we make use of that and make that all make sense by building incrementally from that, or by using an interceptor sewer, or effectively and coordinating both what we've got on the ground now and incremental extensions to that.
Why are they 2 different? I mean, they seem.
I don't know yet. I mean, yeah, right. One is a little bit more detailed than the other, and they may collapse into one.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, consider this as a kind of first draft for discussion, and not necessarily. Number 5 is urban experience.
Marty, can I
Yeah.
just ask one other
Sure.
question? When we're talking about greenfield, are we using that term because there isn't any brownfield that's not infill?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I mean, we're not, so we're not in any case that we know of in Ames going out to like a contaminated site that, on the edge of the city. So greenfield generally means areas that are not developed right now.
Yeah, and
that are
I've
outside of
I've been pretty clear that I want to be with RDG, that the structure, I want to be clear what's expansion versus infill and
That's right,
development.
yeah.
And if you think of the current LUPP, it used the words new lands. And so to us, we're using the more universal term of greenfields to mean new lands is what the old plan talked about, which was really
Yeah.
those expansion areas of the city.
Yeah, what new lands means to me is the Netherlands.
So greenfields
filling
is
the
more
ocean.
is a just kind of a generic universal term in planning,
Yeah.
and that's why we're using it.
Yeah. But yeah, so greenfield is areas that have not had previous development.
Okay.
Urban experience, that land use policy will create a rewarding, healthy, safe, and comfortable environment for all residents and visitors. So, so the quality of the environment, the interactions that people have, the quality of public space and so forth falls within that principle. Process, land use decisions will be made through a transparent, collaborative process that remains true to long-term community goals. One of the elements, as you'll see there, involves, and I think this is an important thing, is having a fairly systematic program of working with local stakeholders in advance to develop more specific area plans, so that there's a higher degree of predictability both to neighbors and to developers. So, so I mean, obviously, this is not a city that does things that are not highly public. There are some that do. This is not one of them, and it's rather important to enshrine that in the plan. Finally, planning for equity. Future development in Ames and the public investments that support it, including housing, parks, and other community assets and features, will redound equitably to the public. So this is one we're still working on, because equity is this term that everybody throws around, but nobody exactly knows what it means. But a good example of it is to say that that facilities like parks are relatively accessible and serve everybody in the city with access to those facilities without discriminating or excluding one part of the city from another. In housing, it means providing actions that address a range of affordability for all populations, as opposed to just one single monoculture. Again, it's become a new buzzword in planning. I've been to several sessions at conferences on it. It's not clear that people always know exactly what it means, but some level of equal treatment or equitable treatment. So these all relate to growth, and then there's another set of principles that relate to land use policies. I mean, that as opposed to growth being new development and stuff that's related to the 15,000 or so people that we anticipate adding to the city in the planning period to 2040. So again, these are at this point our initial shot at these principles, all of which then become the framework for the specific actions and policies that achieve them. So our first step is for you to look at these, say something's missing here, or doesn't feel right, or isn't necessarily implying something that we that we want. What we've been trying to do is to synthesize what we've heard at the various things that we've done so far in terms of engagement and from the online presence. So land use now. So now we're getting into what are the guiding principles behind an actual land use map this is something that's now in formulation that we hope to introduce to you in January. But there's a whole kind of series of different directions to go with a land use map that go away from the old kind of Euclidean yellow is residential, red is commercial, gray is industrial, and start to look at mixing and intensities and more policy oriented kinds of things. So these are going to help a little bit in terms of guiding us in those in those directions. So the principles here that we've developed are appropriate location. So land uses in Ames will be located on sites that provide transportation, infrastructure, and support services necessary to support their intensity and operational requirements. So for example, even in a mixed use zone, not every site within a mixed use district or a mixed use designated area is created equally. A commercial site in the middle of a predominantly residential area that does not have the infrastructure to support it, for example, is not something that we necessarily want to see, even if we wound up going to a much more kind of intensity-based land use format. So appropriate location means that that we need a certain kind of street network or street facility to support, say, commercial, or to support higher density residential, and so it sets up those kinds of criteria. Number two, flexibility with compatibility. Land use plan will provide both reasonable flexibility to developers while protecting the integrity and quality of the neighborhoods of the surrounding. There's a little bit of grammatical issue there of the surrounding neighborhoods around a specific kind of development. So this is getting into issues of saying we don't want to mandate necessarily a specific type of development without a transition to what's already there. That we want to establish what does compatibility mean, what happens at the junction points between say a high density residential setting and the single family neighborhood that's around it. So one example that I like to show, and a lot of these things wind up getting illustrated, is the Beltline in Atlanta. And I don't know how many of you have seen that, but the Beltline will be a loop that's a green space loop and a light rail loop that grew out of a project that was done as a graduation thesis by an architecture student at Georgia Tech that's now become kind of the major kind of community vision. The part of the Beltline that's developed, that's encompassed about $2 billion worth of development, is adjacent to a very actively organized single-family residential neighborhood, historic residential neighborhood. And yet the density that this project has generated is very high. So they did a brilliant job of stepping down from a very high density multifamily and townhouse setting to lining a street that's the adjacent street with single family houses that look just like the single family houses that are historic across the street. And you have no idea that there's a residential density that's around 60 units per acre, about 150 or 200 feet away from this street of historic houses. They've really done an incredible job of that transition. So when we talk about flexibility with compatibility, it means having different types of say housing or even commercial development, but establishing transitional standards that maintain compatibility with existing development. And generally, people are much more friendly with that than they are with a 5-story building across the street from their single-family house. Number 3, convenient services. All parts of Ames will have convenient access to neighborhood commercial services and other vital community facilities. So we want to somewhat decentralize at least neighborhood commercial services to create walking and biking distance neighborhoods to the maximum degree that we can. Vital mixed uses. Ames will encourage mixing of uses to create more active, interesting, and efficient city environments, while again maintaining compatibility where different uses adjoin. So a lot of these things may again collapse or get refined, but they're thoughts that we wanted to make sure we had down on paper.
So I have a question there.
Yeah, Tim.
So we've been thinking mostly about adding the 15,000. So I'm intrigued with the convenient services. So we're also thinking about maybe some rezoning internally to create.
That's
some of
right.
that.
That's right.
So that's a new piece that we haven't
Right.
talked about.
Right.
So thank you.
Yeah. And establishing standards that show where those are going to be acceptable. Yeah. So
That's a big lift.
it's a big change. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Places for employment, that Ames will continue to provide appropriately located space for a wide range of enterprises that provide employment for existing and prospective residents. So, so this again, many of these things are principles that will guide the mapping, the actual physical future land use plan. Finally, diverse housing options. Land use policy will encourage integration of different residential densities into the fabric of neighborhoods. So, I mean, in a way, these are very tightly related, and some may be combined, but they're things we want to make sure that they're points. If you all agree that these are points that guide us from a policy perspective as we start to develop the physical map expression of what we're talking about. Any thoughts or reactions to these, or things that you, again, we don't need to make decisions tonight, but they're kind of the introductory ideas.
Might add too, it's like from our last meeting, what we indicated is that we've got all this public input, and what we're trying to do is translate that information into something that there's thousands of comments, and what we're trying to do is make sure that we're capturing that. And we still might be missing some things, but we're trying to articulate here. And and it's going to take some time to absorb it. We recognize that. And so even though we're presenting it today and over the next couple of weeks, if you feel like there's something that we need to come back to a month from now, that's fine. But we're hoping that we're getting a good course when we're going into the action items.
Yeah, it's a very different model from the kind of traditional, again, what we call Euclidean model of separate uses. That it's much more, it's much more integrated. The lines are blurred. That's where the standards of what makes sense next to what, and what kinds of support facilities need to be provided to make those work, get to be very important. So it turns out to be a different kind of land use map.
So just to be, and I'm always here if you want to know what does it mean compared to the LUPP now. So you can say that's in the LUPP now, and it is, but in a very narrow way, because it wanted to package that all up as a village.
As a village.
And I don't want anybody to interpret that these statements are just regurgitated 1997 LUPP. They might have similar concepts, but it doesn't mean it's going to be implemented the same. So to us, that doesn't translate into everything's a 40-acre village, or it's or scale up. Villages will be fine. That could accomplish that goal, but
Absolutely.
there's probably other ways to look at land use planning and looking at larger areas developing with a mix of uses than just the village concept. So
Yeah, and I think you'll see that in some of the diagrams that we're going to show you in terms of infill too.
it kind of showed up in the sustainability, or not sustainability, the scenario models where RDG first did that. We did it in different ways. One version was more village node centric. One was more spread out and heterogeneous. And so we're trying to deal with all of that.
But they're all generating about the same density, the same gross density. That's another issue.
In terms of,
Could you-
just
Sorry.
No, sorry.
an observation is, to me, it's really important this be in layman's terms. I would prefer to have the language such that you wouldn't have to give examples or here's what we mean. Yeah, actually, some of your explanations, I think, were good. And I'd prefer to see those in there than I would actually have some of this verbiage, because it just seems like I would like to have anyone from the general public be able to pick this up and understand without asking
Yeah.
questions. Like, what does it mean for this? I think some of them hit on that and accomplished that, but I think a lot of it, I'm really working hard mentally to try and understand what does this really mean and what are the impacts. And I think if we have to do that, that's going to make it more difficult for people when they're trying to develop property, and also for council now and in the future to say, what do we really mean by this? And so if we can try and capture that, that's just my initial.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Chris, did you have something else you wanted to?
Yeah, I just had a question about the appropriate location statement. So when you're looking at potential greenfield development on the edge of town, how do you balance providing the intensity and operational requirements of that development at that point in time versus what the operational intensity requirements of that infrastructure particularly happens as the city grows beyond that?
Yeah, that's actually where we get into the tiers, because in greenfield areas, each of these tiers, as we're calling them, require different levels of infrastructure investment. So we'll get to that. That may help a little bit when we get into that piece. It's coming a little bit later.
So I have one observation and one question. I think in some ways I'm maybe on the same page with John with this, that I'm reading this and thinking there are a lot of terms here that would have to be defined, that we'd have to establish parameters for, like what is convenient or what is
Correct.
reasonable
Yeah.
or what's
Yeah.
appropriate.
Yeah.
And so it seems like there's a lot of that front end establishing of measurement and definition that could add to the understandability of the text. But the other thing I wonder is, and maybe this is just me taking a leap here, does this open up the potential for more form-based zoning?
Yes,
Okay.
it could. Although we're not necessarily saying you have to do that.
Could you
But-
do that under this sort of a plan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
so it
could.
would enable
So
that.
a great example, and it's
So,
Yeah.
so just to make sure everybody knows, form-based code means you're much less concerned about use and care much more about how the building is
looks,
used. It
right?
looks
How the
rather than all the
scale
uses.
works. Yeah. So think about just a simple example would be a project, an apartment project. You don't have any cases like this at all, but an apartment project that wants to go next to a primarily single-family neighborhood. That never happens here, right? Yeah.
Or-
All right. So a transition would be that can happen, but in order for it to happen, the building needs to step down in scale so that as it hits the adjacency, the point where it interacts with, it interacts. That's another jargon word, but it's physically next to the smaller house, that the scale of the building steps down to meet that scale. So and establishing that kind of a step down envelope would be an example of a form-based regulation. There's nothing, the thing is, there's nothing new about form-based codes. That in fact, the original 1960 New York City zoning code was a form-based code. And it's somewhat later iterations generated the step-down architecture of skyscrapers in New York in the 1920s, because it was all designed about getting light down on the street. So you were allowed more coverage at the base and had to step back in order to allow light to penetrate down to street level. Form-based code, 103 years ago.
Yeah, we got to move off form-based codes. We got a lot of content.
Yeah. Okay. So now,
So I'll do this one.
yeah,
So,
Kelly's gonna do this one.
so we talked about,
Before we go on, is there any other questions or comments on these first two slides and these visions that you guys would have?
so what's coming is more detail about those in the upcoming slides. So we're going to come back to them with more explanation.
Yeah.
We didn't want to forget about transportation. We've said as all
I was
along.
very proud of this photograph, by the
Marty
way,
took
that I
the
took in the winter.
So when we started the process for the comprehensive plan, we said we weren't going to reinvent the wheel about transportation. We just adopted the Complete Streets policy, the Complete Streets manual, which is a directive to Public Works about how to approach transportation of all modes. And there's concepts in there that we do need to bring forward. So this is a vision statement that is cobbled together from the Complete Streets plan. I think it captures the essence that we want to be a connected community and deal with all modes of traffic and deal with all with comfort levels and safety levels for everyone. So I think this should be very familiar, not objectionable to anyone. The next page, again, this is really coming straight out of the Complete Streets plan with two exceptions that you're going to see on the next page, because the Complete Streets plan has a lot of detail, and this plan is not telling you how to design a road. It's telling you the kinds of roads we need.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between that. The Complete Streets manual tells Public Works how to go through an assessment of what the priorities are, what costs can be, and how we're going to do things when we need to do it. So these principles, for the most part, are pretty straightforward. They are acknowledging that we are a connected city, multimodal in nature, and we need to improve that, not just rest on our laurels, but we need to improve it as well as extend it to the new growth areas. And that's an expectation, is that we will have, again, equitable transportation access. One thing that's going to come up is transit. We want to plan for transit service to exist. We know that the plan doesn't say transit will be there necessarily, but we want to make sure it works when it can get there, when that's a decision that's possible by SIRIDE. So those are kinds of examples where the land use wants to match up with the transportation.
So is that suggesting that we start trying to work more towards transit corridors?
So I think that'll be inherent in some of the land use policies, that we want to make sure that there are serviceable areas by transit, which in corridors are probably the most common way to think about that now, that you have transit-centric corridors with higher densities, easier to serve, have more customers, have better access.
Yeah, keep in mind that these two areas are really interrelated.
Yep. So the old plan kind of just thought about operations for
Yeah.
transportation facilities, but we want to blend them so that we get the right land use to go with the
Right.
operations. So two things I want to point out about these particular principles are: level of service is a traffic engineering term that we all live with, but don't know we live with it. Council might know they live with it because they get this once in a while. It talks about the efficiency of moving vehicles through intersections or overall street capacity in segments. We think, and this has been discussed with the Public Works Department, and it's also kind of part of the Complete Streets policy, is that we're not always trying to achieve the highest level of vehicle throughput. There are other considerations. And one way of thinking about that is to actually change our level of service standard for cars, which is a level C. It's a grading scale of A to F. I shouldn't say grade, but that's how they letter it. So we would go down a notch to D, which means we accept more delay for cars because there might be other priorities in an area.
Right.
It might be because we want to make sure there is still a sidewalk there. We're not going to remove that to build a turn lane. It might mean that we want to have bike lanes instead of 5 traffic lanes. But these are the context-sensitive decisions that will come out of council discussion and public outreach. It won't just be a one-size-fits-all decision. So some of these policies are gearing this up to say, hey, it's going to be a lot of context-sensitive decisions, not just this is how we do it all the time. We don't want to underbuild infrastructure either, though. So you don't go into a new area and only say we're going to have a 2-lane road when we know 10,000 people are going to go on that road. So don't misinterpret that we're going to make ourselves fail on purpose with growth. This is to deal with issues probably more in the city than outside of the city in how we want to respond to transportation.
What really needs to happen is a different level of service standard. I mean, a conceptually different standard, because LOS right now in engineer parlance is how little delay there is and how fast traffic moves through an area. And it doesn't measure other levels of performance, like how safe is it? What does it do to the surroundings around it? How does it reinforce our neighborhoods? So I don't know if we'll be able to invent something.
We're not going to be able to invent that.
But
I've talked to Damien quite a bit about this. You're also doing the transportation plan update that's been kicked off for the MPO. The main emphasis through those processes are not just connections, but safety and efficiency. And they do work on different measures, but still level of service is a relevant term. It's not the ideal term and definitely not the only term to use for that.
So
The other thing, go ahead. The last thing I want to bring up on the slide is comp plans probably don't directly deal with parking, but I wanted to put out there that as a city, we probably don't think that parking is the priority feature of development. So I'm not sure we'll have directive policies in the comp plan about how to deal with that. It's kind of more of a zoning issue, but I wanted to get it out there that parking itself should not be a driver of major land use decisions. And that's a different model, especially if you go back to the 90s. Everybody's going to drive somewhere, make sure parking's abundant, whether it's used or not. And here we want to be more, I chose right size because I'm not saying none, but let's not overburden ourselves with parking. So go ahead, John.
So it's just saying that we're looking at this technology upgrade and running fiber, down South Duff. I think my understanding is that with technology, we're able to potentially get more throughput. So because I think everyone gets frustrated going and having every stoplight you get hit at, you think you won the lottery when you go from one side to the other, you don't hit a red light. So if through technology we can actually keep the traffic moving, would that actually raise your LOS from a D to a C? Is that the measure? Is it throughput or is it?
It's mostly throughput. So Damien would have more technical issues that he would want to focus on as well for the amount of green time and the travel time overall.
Right.
But what you're saying is the idea with the technology is that we can get more through in the same amount of infrastructure.
Correct.
Without failing the performance. That's where Damien's going with those proposals that you guys have been accepting.
yeah, I almost describe it as what you want is a slower, smoother traffic flow.
So the technology should help us maintain a quality system without having to
Right.
build bigger roads.
roads.
That's the whole goal.
Mhm.
If that won't work everywhere, but that's the goal.
Mhm.
That's the most cost conscious option for us too in the long run.
Mhm.
And then part and parcel of that level D, does that also include, is it implicit that bike lanes are going to be included in that? Because that's something that council's talked about.
So-
They're pretty committed to that, or how?
So that's not part of level of service. That's part of the complete streets and multi-modality. Level of service is really a calculation about cars.
So by having complete streets in there, that captures that vision and that.
Yep. So complete streets, multimodality, context sensitive principles, balanced transportation, those are all straight out of the complete streets policy you've already adopted. The other three are kind of relating it back to land use and other things that matter to us as well.
Yeah. So the interesting issue with bike lanes is the question of who is the design market? And so the concept of designing for all ages and all capacities generally mandates greater separation as opposed to traditional bike lanes, which then has an impact upon street design and routings and so forth.
So there is, since you adopted that policy for complete streets, there is still the implementation is we need to go through codes like the subdivision code and match up different policies. So we've been looking at that, but we want to make sure land use matches up as well. And that's where we're headed right now in the comp plan. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions on transportation right now?
Okay, so now we forgive this font screw up. The numbers are going to look really weird here so now we're going to go into the growth principles and kind of the subsets, the explanations under that, specifically for growth, for the growth principles. We're going to explore the land use specific elements are going to grow out of this kind of interactive process of putting the map together. So we're just going to look at this one set of things. So here, the sustainable growth principle that land use policy, what we mean here, advances efforts towards supporting economic vitality and both local and global sustainability interests or goals. So that could theoretically get into standards about that are objective measurements, like reaching a certain level of vehicle miles traveled per capita in 20 years, a reduction of that, or a reduction in emissions or in traffic loading. We're not totally there yet in terms of measurements, but this gets accomplished from a land use policy point of view by incorporating minimum development densities, and you'll see what we're suggesting there in a minute. Incorporating transportation system planning and service levels into planning decisions, supporting expansion of alternative transportation modes, alternatives to single occupant automobiles, avoiding environmentally sensitive areas when feasible, incorporating appropriate buffers and mitigation when required, supporting economic development that builds on the city's strength and regional position, and using natural resources wisely to reduce further burdens on water, energy, and land. So here's where we're starting to get into how do we define what sustainability, what economic and environmental sustainability actually mean from an operational point of view. And then this translates to actions and then ultimately to measurements to try to test how well we're accomplishing a goal.
So so not everybody knows all the things that you guys do every Tuesday. So for the public that might wonder, well, why is climate action plan not mentioned? The city council has this parallel tract. You just hired a separate consultant to complete a greenhouse gas inventory for the community. And the process that council endorsed with that was to complete the inventory separate from the comp plan, look at how a climate action plan, which is more really specific measures about reducing emissions, how that would come together for the community. And if necessary, come back and incorporate that into the comp plan. So you have a parallel track that's really going to deal with really specific issues about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And we would kind of a placeholder, but we don't really have a specific thing in the comp plan saying this is how it's going to be done, because council has it set up as a parallel process at this point in time. So I hope that's informative to the public and understand why it's being set up this way.
But this stuff is now getting us to how are we going to do it? What are the actual actions that will wind up from a component perspective that will get us to this point?
Kelly, I thought that we had discussed that we have a variety of different planning documents. We got the complete streets, got the transportation plan, we've got, our other
Park master plan.
all that. It's my understanding that the goal was, and that's what they had in the Champaign ones, they basically said these are supporting documents that also influence decisions. And I thought that we were going to put on that library shelf the comp plan and not come back and start changing this comp plan, but so that they're complementary, but we're not going back. Otherwise, are we going to have a mess? Because we're going to be going back and forth trying to change all these different plans to try and get different parts and pieces. I mean, I appreciate the fact I've heard council is very supportive of really wanting to go down this path, but I'm just concerned that if we're saying we're gonna come back in a year or two and start making these changes, that's what I heard you say. Maybe I misunderstood.
I think potentially there are changes. In general, it's a reference document at the same
Right,
level
that's
as
the
the
term,
park
yeah.
master plan and the transportation plan. What I meant was that if in the climate action plan, there's a specific measure that deals with land use, you're going to have to go back into the comp plan if it conflicts and make them reconciled.
Okay.
We're not going to go take all the features of a climate action plan and start to write that into the comp plan. That's not our goal. But you can't have conflict or you won't be able to make decisions.
Thanks for clarification.
Okay.
That's all.
So now, this gets into now the idea of the concentric or multi-directional development that the projected population growth for the planning period takes place in areas that can be feasibly served by vital infrastructure. So we've thought that kind of in a global sense, there are three different areas to think about within our urban services area. Urban services area, of course, is the area that we can serve with sanitary sewer service and our existing wastewater facilities, so that it's basically gravity flow, and Ames is pretty well set up for that. So there are three levels of this. And number one is infill, which is increasing, we define as increasing the yield of underused sites within the existing urban area, always served by existing infrastructure. Then we get to areas in all directions contiguous to existing development that can be served either by existing infrastructure or by relatively low-cost extensions. And then three, so that's going to correspond to what we're going to be calling tiers 1 and 2. And then 3 is areas within the urban services area that require significant infrastructure extensions or new facilities. So these are going to roughly correspond to what we're calling tiers 3 and 4. It's interesting because we can pretty much accommodate all of our projected growth within those first 2 bullet points. So in a sense, we're planning for 20 years, but also with an eye toward what happens much farther out in the future. And then the future land use map then defines areas for growth and change and provides options that help us meet housing and economic development goals. So these get expressed through the mapping process. So if we looked at this diagrammatically, it looks something like this. So that red circle is roughly the urbanized area of Ames right now. The yellow lines, by the way, are major street corridors. And the blue ellipses are generally the areas that we would say are relatively easily served, and the purple ellipses are the ones that require greater extensions. And again, this is just a diagram to describe that, but it shows that each of the 4 ordinal directions has areas within that can be served feasibly by urban services, but move in all 4 directions.
So is this is helpful if if this is reality, because it shows.
It will be a reality on December 19th.
It will be, right.
This is just a diagram.
This is a diagram. It's just a diagram right now. But we'll show you another iteration of this that starts to look a little bit more like the scenarios that we've already looked at.
Well,
That really, in one slide, can potentially illustrate for everybody to easily understand
Yeah.
that light blue, we can pretty much easily handle that based on your analysis.
That's right. Yeah.
But the purple, while we could potentially support going that direction, is going to take up a notch the level of investment either on the city side for services or whatever. So the only adage of words, pictures are worth 1,000 words. If that, again, I don't know if it was just theoretical, like we think this might be this way, or if it actually has.
Yeah, it has a sense of reality to it. Yeah.
So can I want to follow up on Chris's question. I think it was really good. So one of the advantages of putting all of our blood and treasure towards one direction is that it allows us to make sizable investments in terms of the sizing of the infrastructure. It's difficult for me to imagine that we would plan for 15,000 in each of the directions. So in a couple sentences, can you explain this concept of incremental growth and how that's compatible with sizing of infrastructure? Is that a possible short answer?
Yeah, it's interesting because, and we'll be able to confirm this a little bit better for you by the 19th, because that'll start to put actual extensions and costs into play. But in theory, we could accommodate the entire projected growth that we're projecting up to 2040 in those 4 light blue areas, or something like them. But in looking at sizing, the purple areas then enter into consideration as well, because some of these are easier to serve than others. They're not necessarily all equal, right? So here's an example. Let's say that this blue area, the boundary there, which is sort of overlaid, corresponds to 190th Street, as an example. It kind of does. But it's relatively easy to serve that light blue area right now with what's already out there. But the purple area is actually quite difficult to serve. Whereas this purple area down here is probably significantly easier to serve with sewers. It has other costs that relate to transportation, but so does this. So it's kind of a question of, do you say, well, we have a variety of choices, and that is, do we go all in one direction, or do we go in different directions and have the option, if the market demands it, of oversizing utility, because the chances of these ultimate this ultimate development is more likely to happen in one place than another one.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna get into a lot more detail, but I think I think we are planning for beyond 2040 by the nature of the task you gave us.
That's right. Yeah.
So when you see 15,000 people there, you're gonna say this needs a 72-inch sewer line, this needs a 5-lane road for full build out. Like that's the stuff that we're doing. We're not evaluating if can I get by on a 2-lane road for this long. We're saying this is what's necessary for full build out of these areas. And that's what's going to help break us into these tiers and give you populations and costs. And then we'll have to sort out, if you like those areas, then we'll get more into what has to happen when.
I think what Tim is asking, when you do the analysis, if you're going to just serve the blue area and take care of the next 10 years, are you going to put in the cost of oversizing? Because you're not going to come back oversized. So when you show it's less costly, you're still going to have the oversizing in there, aren't you?
We're going to have
to prepare for it to grow past that into the purple. If you don't do that now in your calculation, you're not going to be able to.
But that's what I try to say is we're going to say it needs a 5-lane road to serve 15,000 people. You're going to have to build that first segment of a 5-lane road, or at least reserve the right of way for it to happen when you do need it later. That's the incremental stuff. What do we need now for sure? What do we need to plan for? I think you have a bullet more about
he's
that.
He's asking about the infrastructure itself. Sewer, you will overbuild a sewer, even that blue.
Have to. Yeah, so sewer, pipes you have to, right? That's roads, you have a little more flexibility.
Right.
Roads you can plan for, pipes.
You can widen, or
so it's going to
the
depend
answer
on
is
which
when they do the economic analysis, they'll have it'll be upsized so it could carry serve areas past that.
Thanks for clarifying that. That's very important.
That's a good question.
It's a great question.
Could you tell me how we're defining feasibility? What is it? Clearly, it's not the cost, because that's rolled into these other things. So is that topography, land ownership?
No, it really is cost. So for example, it may very well be, and we don't know this for sure yet, but well, this actually is kind of true. In the east area, This is
Oh,
I-35. So this blue area can be served by infrastructure that's generally being built with some of the commercial around 13th Street and with the industrial area.
So is everything
But
feasible?
these purple areas can't be served by that. So this
See, you
blue
can-
area, that the concept here is this blue
I
area
don't even know what that means.
will actually piggybacks on other investments that are already being made. But this purple area will need additional new investment.
So I think for me, this principle number 2, if you go back a slide, I think this is directive of getting to that land use map that you will adopt.
Yeah.
You will make a decision about what's feasible based on how you adopt that future land use map, because you're going to show areas where the city can expand, and you will have made a decision that that's feasible or not feasible. And to do something else would have to be a separate evaluation at some time. So I think this one's directing us for the next few months. It's not directing us 10 years from now. Does that help? Give a little bit about, again, what's administration in the future, what versus what's designing the plan today.
Well, one more just point on this. We use the phrase here, relatively low cost incremental extensions. That's almost going to be counterintuitive if we're spreading the cost of a larger infrastructure over a smaller number of units. That's going to make the developmental costs higher for those particular units. So the goal generally is to spread those development costs over many units.
Right.
So I don't want to go into a long conversation about that, but I'm just putting a bookmark there. That's going to be a substantial topic of conversation if we're going to, just to summarize this, we're going to truly build this to scale, but not build out the number of units. I'm having trouble wrapping my brain around that being relatively low cost.
Yeah, but the question becomes, do you, for example, oversize a sewer now for an area that may not develop till after 2040?
So this is December.
This is
19th.
kind of, this is,
So you don't have any information right
Yeah,
now
yeah, I just
to
wanted
to
talk
bookmark
about.
but I mean, there are a lot of questions.
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
bookmarking that because
Yeah,
that's going to be an important conversation.
It is, and that's where we'll have numbers for you. And is
Right.
a million low cost or is 10 million low cost? Those are things you're gonna have to grapple with on the night.
Well, and we keep talking about wanting affordable housing. The city's role in financing this is going to be a big topic. So just
Yep.
set the table.
And we're not gonna tell you how to finance it. We're
Right.
gonna say what the costs are on the 19th.
yeah, and I mean, if a developer came forward and said, I want to build a new town on the east side of I-35, and there's a big infrastructure investment to provide sewer service to that new town, but the cost per unit, because of the scale of it, might be relatively low eventually when it's fully built out. We need to have some framework to make that decision. Do you say yes or no, or you pay for it, or what level of partnership do we enter into? So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of strategic questions to be answered, and the interesting thing is that this process we've gone through that has basically loaded 20 years of growth into each one of 4 or 5 areas is very helpful in terms, not because we would necessarily do it that way, but it helps us break things up into incremental chunks.
Yep, thanks.
I have a question here too. On this slide, when we talked through the first few bullet points, I think you associated them with tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is that association something that we're likely to see sort of fixed, or is it going to be a decision that we will be making as to how to incorporate these considerations with, for example, sustainable growth?
We're going to show you some geography of that, what that means,
Geography.
what the areas are.
They're going to show you designated on a map those
Yeah,
tiers
that's
for
right.
each one of those 4 scenarios.
Okay, so my question is, are the tiers corresponding to these bullets, or do they take in additional considerations such as the sustainable growth considerations?
So the task is we're trying to get you the quantitative information that we can deliver. So we will have what the expected infrastructure to serve is, break it out into population served in the different tiers, We will have some output about vehicle miles traveled from the
Right.
traffic model, not just the congestion that's generated. But in our eyes, stuff like energy consumption's universal. So we're not calculating the energy consumption, because whether the house is in North Ames or South Ames, it's the same
Doesn't-
energy consumption.
Same energy cost, right?
So there will be a little bit of that in there, but we're not making decisions about the tiers based on policies. We're basing it on the cost and level of service. And can they accomplish these goals of having neighborhoods? Like if it's a really small area and doesn't really make a neighborhood, then that's not the scale
Unless
we're
it
talking
completes an
about.
existing neighborhood.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because generally the sort of multi-directional incremental growth is going to tend to reduce VMT. That because, you know, if you imagine the primary employer being ISU and areas around it and so forth, then the amount of travel, the amount of travel from everybody is going to be somewhat smaller than if there's a big sort of bulge out in one direction.
That's fine. So what I'm
Yeah.
hearing is that it's not intended to take those considerations into account when deciding whether it's tier 1, 2, or 3. It has to do with these factors and not the others. Do I have it?
I think just, we don't have that. I think it's
You
kind of
don't know
hard
yet,
to.
that's fine.
Well, we know what we're going with it, but I don't have it packaged for you. And I think it's kind of hard to tell you today what it's going to look like in a week when
Right.
we give it to you.
Right.
Until we've kind of gone through it all as a team and vetted it out about how does it make sense to the public. So
Okay.
is that fair? That's about all we can say tonight. We just wanted to make sure we laid it out there that tiers would be coming with more information.
Okay,
So we got to keep going. We're at the.
yeah, we're gonna be here a while.
Yeah.
I've already done that last night.
Really?
Yeah. Infill development projects. So these are criteria for infill projects, coordinated with the capacity of existing infrastructure, provide choice and housing choice and variety, support higher density redevelopment in targeted areas, fill links or missing links in transportation and trails, provide good transitions to adjacent neighborhoods, which we already talked about, protect environmental resources. So in thinking about infill development and what we want to encourage, these are a shot at criteria to evaluate sites and projects. And then, as you can see, we'll develop policies around these to encourage targeted development. So
Was that just a statement of that's coming?
that's coming, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Which go back slide. You're asking John.
I was asking, it says Ames will develop policies. Is that a statement that's going to be in the plan?
Yeah.
Or-
Yes,
No, we don't want a statement that says we're going to develop policies. We want to actually have them in the plan.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
that was
that's
one of
what
the-
he's
that's
asking,
my
yeah.
point.
That was one of
yeah,
the
that's
confusing
point.
parts of the last LUPP is it talked about adopting policies and you weren't sure if they happened or not. Or how
Yeah,
to
no,
apply
we
them to
are
individual
going
decisions.
to.
It's just, it's
Yeah.
a placeholder, statement placeholder thing.
So this is are some of the areas that we think meet these criteria. And so you're going to see the ones that are in tan, we've worked out some illustrative concepts for. But also the Lincoln Way plan has some others that we've evaluated and sort of done unit counts just for the fun of it to see what we're talking about in terms of capacity.
I'll also add that when we were developing that map, it was through a coordinated effort with the staff. And there might be some sites there that should be there that aren't there that you want to see. And so you'll have opportunity to take a look at that and see if there's other things that we could add.
Okay. Criteria for greenfield development. So this is now getting into, when we think about the differences between 2 and 4, this is getting into the more specific descriptors of what we want to see in these development areas. So contiguity, connections to street networks, high-density nodes that provide services that are serviceable by transit, variety of housing configurations with a gross target density of 5 units per acre, gross minimum target density of 5 units per acre, avoiding floodplains, including connecting green network within the areas, having a master street plan so that those major streets are reserved where they're applicable, connecting or reserving connections to major city destinations and to other growth centers that are identified, provides walkable blocks and good street and pedestrian connections, design streets with appropriate design consistent with the complete streets policy. So these are, as much as anything, ways of both that we can express in the land use plan, but also ways of measuring development proposals. Have you done these things or made provision for those to be in there? The master street plan, for example, gets to identifying streets that in the transportation plan that or connections that need to be there so that when projects come in incrementally, they do that. They reserve that right of way. So now we come to how do these scenarios or these directional scenarios, north, south, east, and west, correspond with that. And so you get something that starts to look like that of how what those pieces look like.
I think this, when we get through the 19th, this will be one of those signature visuals
Yeah.
for the
Yeah,
plan.
I would agree.
Mhm.
It's very powerful.
Mhm.
And is that dotted line, the 2-mile fringe?
Yeah, the dotted line is the fringe, is the
Current fringe.
jurisdictional boundary.
It's
Yeah.
the current fringe, not the future
Yeah.
quadrupling up.
Yeah, that's, and so here we get into the criteria that are describing what each of these tiers actually means. So tier 1, things are generally available. If infrastructure needs to be extended, it can be short. That we've got clear market precedents for it. Tier 2 gets into somewhat longer extensions. So they would be, if logic ruled, they would be the next increment beyond that. Tier 3 still within the urban services area, but requires some significant pioneer infrastructure. Tier 4 is pretty long-term stuff that,
So David, does that help give you a little bit of an answer to your question? So
Yeah.
for RDG, this is kind of the working matrix that they're going
what
through.
these things
is what-
mean.
Is what's bulleted
What's the
here.
significance of the tier? Help me understand that.
It's going to help us break down what
Costs.
population can be served at what
Yeah.
cost.
So if you go back to this slide for sake of discussion.
Yeah.
okay.
So
Would the light blue be a tier 1 or the red be a tier 1?
That's right.
Is that,
Red is existing city.
red is
Won't be a
existing city.
tier.
it won't be a tier?
Nope.
Okay.
It'll
Yeah.
only be the growth.
Blue is kind of 1 and 2.
Okay.
Purple is kind of 3 and 4. Yeah. And together, this would envision an Ames of about 120,000 people or something there.
Right, because
Kind of-
we keep saying if we did everything, that's.
This is kind of the
60,000.
Ankeny solution. Yeah, because each one of those is roughly 15,000. Each one of those clusters is roughly 15,000 people.
So I think we got about 2-3 slides on principles left, and then it's the infill.
Then we get
information.
into infill. So, and these are much quicker. So density policy is to maintain the minimum gross density of 5 DUs per acre in new development areas. And then number 2 is an important one because this says that you can pair a individual project or an individual subdivision, for example, that falls under that requirement or even under the current minimum or max minimum size with higher density development that might be non-contiguous, but that what we're trying to do is to say there are a variety of different ways that that you can achieve 5 dwelling units per acre by combining bigger lots and smaller lots or higher densities.
So I'm going to point out, this is considerably different than current land use
Yeah.
policy plan.
Yeah.
And there are big ramifications to what that means. So we're going to have to flesh that out with you as we move ahead. So
Yeah.
that's it. There's a lot of different ways this could go, but if this is something this is a big difference from the old.
This is a big difference. Yeah, and this is kind of responding to the developer input that we got, but saying, all right, you can do some of those, but you've got to compensate by doing higher density development so that the overall average comes out right.
Just a quick observation, it says non-contiguous. We use the fact that one of our principles is we're going to be doing contiguous development. I think I know what you mean. Maybe you just have a point of
It
clarification.
doesn't have to touch
Yeah,
that.
it doesn't have to touch
Yeah.
or it's not part
Yeah.
of one whole development. It could be in a different location. Just
That's right.
It's just worth. I think I understand what you mean, but just the wordsmithing, just so we don't get
Yeah,
crosswise with
Yeah.
our words.
yeah, good point. But that's what it means.
It's really a fascinating idea, though, in terms of, and it has to also be done concurrent. It would seem like too,
It has to be done concurrent.
or it has to be done and proves the plan. And it's got to be.
So one of the methods in the madness here is to get our builders and developers to expand their range so they don't just build one thing.
Interesting. And they've requested that.
They've requested the first part of it, building lower density. We're going to say, okay, fine, we'll let you do that, but, yeah. Urban experience, so this involves public spaces, increasing the level of enjoyment and engagement of citizens with their city, whatever that means, preserving community character, including historic neighborhoods and what we've called areas of civic prominence. Example, we were talking about example of what that means. Parts of Stang Road or 6th Street or really, I think even Clark Avenue, that are streets that have a feel to them that are that are important, or high visibility environments that provide a strong that are the points of entry that are highly public. So that gets into the Duffs and the Lincoln Ways as well.
I think as we were talking about it's an evolution of the term gateways, right? Because a lot
Yeah.
of plans talk about gateways, but they're at the freeway exits. There's very highly visible and prominent areas in the city, but you wouldn't say it's a gateway necessarily.
Yeah.
So we're trying to capture more than gateways
Yeah.
and talk about kind of those identifiable areas of the city.
That are important to people, that are points of orientation or provide safe, secure, and comfortable environment for its citizens. Process gets into the way decisions are made, which I think is kind of easily stated, but also the idea of working with local stakeholders to do planning that gets pretty specific up front so that people, whether they're the neighbors or developers, know what to expect. So that it's really interesting that one thing that has emerged as a real obstacle to building affordable housing has been unpredictability. And we've heard that in a lot of different places. We spend a lot of money, go to a planning commission, city council, and then they tell us no, and we've wasted that. So don't talk to us about that unless you give us a more predictable approval process. So I think that's actually a really important one.
It's just going to be fleshed out further, Kelly, this slide, because
So
I
I
think
think-
there's a lot of ramifications behind here and lots of questions. I mean, I think there's.
So you're talking about the second part about the sub-area planning?
Well, both.
Well,
I mean,
I think the first one is
what
just,
does collaborative mean?
I think the first one is a commitment that the city involves citizens.
Yeah,
It's not,
that's right.
It's not City Hall making the decisions.
Yeah.
I think that's our nature anyways. I don't feel like that one's stepping out very far.
Mhm.
The second one's going to be more of a product of how the future land use map comes together, how these infill examples work, what are places that you want to do future planning about and need to involve people like the next exercise, there's been no significant public input. It's an exploratory exercise.
Yeah.
So if you like, I love that area, let's work on that. You're gonna have to do a sub area plan like we did with the corridor plan. And in the corridor plan, we went to neighborhoods and said, here's what we're looking at. What do you think? And here's options. And that's what we're trying to say. That's what's important for infill. Some places you might not need to do that, but others you may, especially the more intricate ones.
Yeah.
Which is not really different. We did it for the university area. We've done it for the corridor plan. We've done it a few different times in the city.
So now we get into, it says transportation vision, but these are actually infill possibilities. So one that we were.
Quick, so that's kind of that's the land use principles, growth vision. Is there any, I think I just want to nutshell it before we move into the next part. We've asked for any written comments by January 10th. If there's any other burning thoughts tonight you want to get on the table, let us know right now. Obviously, you can let us know. The next part, the next part that's coming up is the 19th. We've talked a lot about what the 19th is going to be, and it's going to be significant in directing the land use and future land use map activities that will come up to actually put this plan together.
Right.
And now to introduce the next part, way back in April, City Council said do 15,000 people as growth scenarios, but we're interested in infill in the city. So we itemized specific areas for RDG to look at. We didn't tell them, I want to see 700 people live here. We didn't say build an office building here. So RDG took license to kind of illustrate different ideas, get a reaction to what does that mean. It's more about, are these areas that we want to spend more time planning about? And are there any ideas that are interest here to keep moving forward on? It is not designed to change the scenario populations. We view this as additive.
Additive, yeah.
So even though we're planning for 15, if you did all the infill situations, you're planning for 18. So that's how we looked at it. So with that, I'll give it back to Marty and Corey.
Okay, so.
I do have a comment on this. And so when we've done these sub-area plannings, there's a little risk in going into this because we did not have significant amount of public input in some of these ideas. And so what we're establishing here is some precedents for why maybe some of these areas may warrant a more focused study. And so it's really to tease out those ideas and to possibly do a sub-area. So that's helped a number of communities realize that there was areas that we didn't realize needed a sub-area. And so following the comprehensive plan, its implementation, a sub-area plan was done.
All right, so this is an area of real kind of interest, I think. So here this is Lincoln Way East. So Lincoln Way, Duff, Target is there, and
Resource recovery plan is
right there, and the coal pile and so forth. Yeah, so. Not necessarily development ready yet, but only about 40 housing units in this area. Great location near downtown. Some of these surrounding land uses might change. So we took kind of an initial crack at what could happen there, and so the idea here is. Business park or innovation park in this more industrial area that already has that character, more multifamily and mixed use look along Lincoln Way to the south. So these U-shaped buildings are multifamily blocks with lower level commercial along Lincoln Way. A boardwalk that goes along the edge of the ridge there so that you can look down into the floodplain. Single family attached, kind of urban family townhouse sort of development. A street connection that takes Second Street. I think that's Second. Maybe it's Third.
Yeah, no,
comes around. Existing strip center, existing buildings. Target could have a little bit of multifamily along it as well. And this development actually increases the number of units on that area by about 10 times, 12 times actually, to nearly 480. So, kind of a way of thinking about the capacity of these areas, and really could be pretty terrific. Actually, the little illustration here is in Minneapolis, where also with the Target, where this kind of project has been quite literally done. So that's a building like this on the side of Target's parking lot that's got 5 stories of housing over commercial, over retail.
Is the red multifamily?
Yeah, it's new. Yes, it is. Actually, you'll see there's a little, these are not multifamily though. Those
I'm
are
not sure
more.
the coffee shop, the Scooters is going to like seeing their building being torn down. Right?
So Marty, at this point, are you wanting us to give any kind of initial feedback on this, or is this just for?
Illustrative.
It's illustrative. We don't,
Okay.
this may or may not even show up in the plan,
Okay.
but,
Just to give us a sense of what it looks like.
of what it could look like.
Yeah, so I think the direction for tonight is not, I love this, let's do a sub-area plan.
Yeah, right.
I think it's, oh, that's interesting.
That's
Or it's
interesting.
not,
There's an opportunity.
is this a place that we should investigate further? One thing that's different here is that when RDG looked at this is more of a medium to low density redevelopment profile. These are not 5-story buildings on podium.
That's right, yeah.
So that's a totally different redevelopment style. And this is where I'm trying to say that RDG kind of wanted to explore different ideas, not just the normal formula of, well, we just have to do 5-story buildings everywhere. So what goes into making this happen? There's a lot, but it's a different idea for a different area.
So,
And did you talk about in that drawing that the brown buildings are retained buildings?
Are retained
We
buildings,
didn't,
yeah.
I think a couple people noticed the recycling label there. So we didn't presume that the city was able to move that facility. Clearly, that would be ideal if you're going to redevelop it with housing in that area, but we didn't presume that. So that would be a big consideration if you were to look at this as a redevelopment area. How does it really fit with residential?
yeah, same thing with the coal pile.
Yeah.
Yeah, although it makes it really easy if you're into recycling.
Walk across the street.
It could be marketed to people who are master recyclers.
Let's
Essentially
not go
recycling.
there.
So,
Yeah,
Tim, did you have thoughts
let's not
about
go there.
about the area and
So-
goals?
So just real quick, and I don't want to have a long conversation, but certainly I've been suggesting that we consider moving the resource recovery plant. You're going to have people, no one's going to want to live across from the resource recovery
That's
plant.
correct.
So,
This suggests that maybe you'd want to, maybe there's a return in doing that in terms of making another area available for redevelopment.
so something that Chuck Winkleblack has helped us to think about is the limitations we have on commercial space. So as we thought about infill, I came in tonight thinking that we would be looking at existing residential areas to increase the density.
Yeah,
And I appreciate the fact this is outside of the box for me. But as a council, if we displace that commercial, I have Chuck's voice in my ear. Where is that going to go? And so as we think about this 2040 plan, we have to make sure we have room for those kinds of businesses in our community.
that's right. And actually, these buildings are not, see the idea of these buildings is that the parking is at grade with residential behind it, and then the parking is hidden by commercial. So those little extensions,
So I think we're cognizant of that.
Yeah, we know that,
we
yeah.
don't want to push everything out of the city because we could build an apartment building there.
yeah, that's
I
right.
think we're trying to be cognizant of that. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up tonight.
And that's
So that
actually the
that's-
existing motel. That should actually be tan.
Yeah, we're actually out of HOC, or we're almost out of HOC property, what we've been told.
That's right. I think we had so back in the existing conditions in March, we gave you a vacant land inventory. And if you want to go, that's up on our website. If you want to go back and look at that, most of the commercial land is in the Southeast 16th Street area. It's not on Duff. It's not on Lincoln Way.
And also everything, this is all commercial. That's all supposed to be commercial or light industrial between Duff and the recycling.
Well, you asked for some feedback. That's a
Yeah.
general feedback, is that's what we've heard. And just seems that may be an opportunity for
Yeah.
HOC out going on East Lincoln Way, but that's your job, not our job.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just our feedback. Good, very good point.
So here's an example. This is, where are we here? This is,
This is Campus Town.
yeah, it's Campus
So we're
Town. Right.
southwest.
That's right,
of
it's
the-
Campus.
South of the intermodal
Yeah,
facility.
which is right there. I was
You're on
kind of
Hayward,
expecting Northwestern and, yeah. So these are like potential redevelopment sites that we evaluated. So it's really hard to tell how many units are here, but I'm guessing it's about 90 to 100 in these various parcels. That would then increase with, number one, this kind of an evaluation and that kind of a land plan with mixed use on the corner, more contemporary, higher density multifamily, some attached housing on the balance of the land, generates about 280 units. And we've avoided anything that was newer infill. So these are all kind of the older multifamily buildings.
So this is one that is not current city policy. So that's something to think about. This is not how our current zoning is set up. This doesn't necessarily facilitate that. This is in the university impact area. So those are different issues that come up, and there have been policy decisions made about those. So if you start to think about infill, does that mean expansion of Campus Town? Does that mean expansion of housing opportunities near campus or not? Those are things you're going to have to think about as we get into these policies about infill.
So when you define infill would also include a redevelopment of existing property,
It principally would be that.
In these cases, yeah.
not
Not-
which is not currently.
Yeah, we don't have that much of that. Yeah,
Except for floodplain.
yeah. So this is now looking at North Grand.
Could you go back just for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. I can't help myself tonight. Sorry.
Well, that's good.
So we have had so many days of discussion about the demographics in the South Campus area neighborhood. I can't help but ask this question. This seems like a wonderful opportunity to provide some housing for staff and faculty.
Yes.
We're hearing in stereo that it's very, very desirable as opposed to intensification of just additional student housing. So
Right.
this is really quite an exciting
Absolutely,
possibility if we could make that happen.
yeah, absolutely.
The problem's gonna be is how are you gonna control that from not being student
Right.
housing? I mean, the point is that you can't discriminate, I don't think, can you? And say you can't, yeah, or maybe you can, I don't know. Anyway,
You can.
The comp plan will not.
Yeah, exactly.
I
yeah,
know that.
Yeah.
There you
there you
go.
go. All right.
we will say what our intention
Okay.
is. So this one is now looking, this is a lot smaller in individual scale, but this is looking at site opportunities along North Grand. So here's the mall, right? North Grand Mall. And these are really pretty small sites and a couple of opportunities for some residential. So this is getting more into the neighborhood plan kind of level as opposed to a significant redevelopment project. And this is almost all vacant or underused land. Looking at the parking lot that's probably oversized and how pieces of that could be used.
So Kelly, we talked about, you mentioned rethinking the redevelopment or development and the amount of parking. So would that also affect or be applicable to infill or redevelopment? Because if, let's just say North Grand came back and just said, hey, we can do this, this, and this if we reduced our quantity of parking, we're just not using that.
Mhm.
Would that statement that was in earlier that you mentioned, and you said it's kind of deep change, would that also be applied to existing properties, or how would that work?
I think so. I think matters maybe more so on the redevelopment side because your space is more limited. And so with redevelopment, what are you trying to accomplish? Is it yield or convenience? Or are you trying to fill in a gap in the neighborhood? And it's more important to have the project than it is to have 20 extra parking spaces. Like,
Right.
to me, the 20 extra parking spaces are not worth it.
Right.
So,
And it's-
so that's the kind of stuff that's going to matter on the infill projects to make them viable, lowers their cost. They don't have to build that parking. They'll build some. I'm not saying none. But like, for example, current policy in the university impact area is to provide 25% more parking than anywhere else in the city. That has a cost implication to those projects. And at that time, that was important. It was a different idea maybe about using Cyride and biking and walking than there is today. But maybe it's worth revisiting that policy. Yep.
And commercial parking standards are usually sized for the peaks that don't really exist anymore, rather than the routine. So that opens up opportunities, yeah.
I think we're gonna have to revisit or think about or talk about our stormwater. If you start taking and start disturbing this area, then if you get over 10,000 square feet, are you gonna go ahead and have to put in stormwater detention?
So we're at an acre. So all of this stuff would be the acre standard, which is a much larger site than.
Oh, that's
than
right.
the
We
10,000.
went over
So
10,000.
so we bumped up to
That's
an
right.
acre, not an acre of disturbed, an acre of impervious. So that's a significantly larger site.
Point being is that I think there's a lot that's all goes into this discussion.
This one, this was an interesting one too. So here, this is Northwestern Avenue, right up there. Kind of cool neighborhood. There's about 16 housing units in here. A lot of kind of vacant or underused, or so the idea here was, well, what if we wanted to develop a urban townhouse neighborhood out of those sites, what could we do? So it kind of takes this backside, does housing there, between the DOT, the historic DOT building and the credit union, puts a bridge over Grand Avenue to connect those together, maybe looks at redeveloping that smaller single-family neighborhood. And again, then we wind up with 160 units out of kind of urban family workforce housing.
So I think this one probably is just like Campus Town done. This one's going to be a big policy issue for you.
Yeah.
Do you promote this change because you want to accomplish other goals in a completely viable area right now? You're not forcing anybody to sell their property,
Right.
but you're open to
Opening
that acquisition and
possibilities,
seeing
yeah.
things happen. So those are the kinds of infill decisions, are the hard ones. And establishing clear policy about that will help you make decisions going forward.
The model for those buildings is this project in downtown Omaha, which is a very successful development. This is Dakota and Lincoln Way, that kind of steep grade there. So kind of trying to figure out a way to use that. Not that different from the building on the new building on the northeast corner.
The other thing with that, we have looked at doing commercial on that corner. We actually had a referral to look at doing office
tough.
commercial on that area because there was a lack
Yeah.
of commercial on the west side of town.
Yeah.
They didn't move forward with that, but maybe that's something that's worth addressing, that commercial land use
Yeah.
need as well.
Like some of the concern was just access to and from North Dakota
It's
and,
tough.
or, allow access
It's
off
tough.
of Lincoln Way. It's the grade and everything else is really.
Yeah, we almost said this is not feasible.
It's not easy.
It's not easy. These, of course, being here, yeah, these are from the Lincoln Way plan. So those three projects are about 400 units. This is all industrial on North Dayton.
So this is across from the National Disease Lab.
Yeah.
So this is probably stretching infill,
Yeah, this is not.
but it wasn't actually in any of our scenario growth areas. It's just an area that's serviceable because we have water and streets and sewer there. So we asked RDG, again, we have other users besides East Industrial. How does this look?
Yeah.
So
Oop, go back.
Kelly, and Maria, are you going to look at the community and look at infill, not just for housing, but for commercial opportunities? Because that's really something that That's what we've heard.
Companions, did you look at south of Lincoln Way between Kellogg to Duff?
Not yet, but we've looked at it and investigated it. And it's a good one. It's actually a really interesting area because it's
Absolutely.
very diverse and
For commercial.
for commercial.
For kind of probably both.
Uh,
Yeah, so.
Well, I mean,
we don't have sketches for-
another good one is the site behind behind what? What?
I don't know.
It's the it's behind Hy-Vee, I guess, or,
Which Hy-Vee?
no, there's a now I'm blanking on what the older big box is.
Hobby Lobby area?
Yeah.
Well, so
No.
that's another one you can think of. The Lincoln Center is again.
Lincoln
So this
Center,
is
yeah.
where, so I want to answer John's question. So these exercises did not necessarily address that. So that's in our consciousness. We definitely don't want to displace without being able to replace, because we know there's a demand for commercial space. We don't have that answer for you tonight. That's going to be part of that future land map exercise. I like to talk about the Lincoln Center because you probably couldn't come up with a more ideal redevelopment project site. But at the same time, that's a valuable commercial asset to the residents. So not every site should turn into something else. There's a reason for shopping centers to exist. We don't want to plan them out.
There's that big vacant area behind it.
And so on the back side
The
is
back
another-
side,
which
that's what
gets back to
that's what I'm
the-
thinking, on the east side, yeah. That's what I was thinking about,
Yeah. So
yeah.
So there's more areas to talk about, but not everything should. I'm not of the position that we should advocate that every commercial site shows mixed use on it because you could.
Right.
I think we want to be selective and realize that commercial uses are hard to replace.
And these things are really showing possibilities, it's, yeah,
We're not developing. This means-
My question, could you back up two
yeah, sure.
slides
Which, 2
Are
slides
willing seller.
to that one?
to that one?
So one cautionary tale about infill and redevelopment. We have, so south of Lincoln Way, not the corridor plan, but 2 blocks south, around 3rd Street, we have an adopted South Lincoln mixed use plan. Looks great on paper. Those goals have not been realized in 15 years. Chuck's smiling because he thinks it's a great plan. So there's something there that we missed on. It was a good idea, but it just didn't work in the market. So we want to be somewhat cognizant of what's ideal and what's also workable, and maybe they don't go together.
So how can we
Yeah.
avoid that from happening again?
Yeah, what was the mistake with
You
that?
can't make them all work. I mean, there's economic viability.
Well, and the other problem is simply land assembly.
Well, there was rules about how things work for land assembly, but there's a lot that goes into these decisions. When you say in sub area, you're going to go talk to the people that live there and work there, that's going to give one opinion. And then there's going to be market reality, and they may not work together. So that's
While you're on that property, what I've heard is that there's also an overlay there, which has really made it very difficult to do much work in that area.
so it made it difficult because that's what was desired to reach the goals of the plan, was to not have large buildings.
I see.
Right. So it's difficult to build large buildings. That's true. The plan allows a lot of things, but in smaller formats. So maybe that's an area where the form-based code idea works, where you care less about what the size or use of it is, just how the streetscape works. And that's a good area that maybe it's so mixed up now with the different commercial and residential uses, it's fine.
So walk us through.
John,
let's-
if we could, Brahma had a point, and I want to make
sorry,
sure we
I
don't miss that point.
Yeah, unless, was it related? My question is about accessory dwelling units. So on this Oak to Riverside focus area on the,
Those are
On the-
ADUs. Whoops, sorry about that.
Yep.
right, so that was something we had seen when that Lincoln Way corridor plan came to us. And that struck me as kind of as an interesting idea for infill, like if we had zones of town where the housing density is very low and we could afford more units per acre, or whatever the term is there, like
Yeah,
what if, how much infill could we achieve by considering maybe allowing accessory dwelling units if a person had a big enough lot in a whole swath of town, right? So we're not just looking at infill in a little chunk of campus town, for example, but you're looking at all of, I don't know, Northridge. I'm just throwing that out there.
well,
But, you know,
in theory, you can double the density on any.
Yeah.
Just.
But I'm sure
gross
there's some parts
units.
of town where you can't because there's not enough room on the lots. Like
Yeah.
in my part of town, you couldn't fit another building on my lot if you tried. But in other parts of town, you definitely could. There's room for that. And I think the neighborhoods could absorb that kind of density. But that concept's not one we're talking about. Or I just don't know how to start that
So
kind
you
of
have,
thing.
you have another chapter about housing policy.
Yeah, that's coming. That's a
Oh.
different,
Oh.
yeah,
So
Oh, wait, there's.
yeah.
we aren't even really talking about housing tonight.
Yeah, but an interesting
It's
thing
opposite.
about ADUs and those ordinances, and I say this because we've got current experience with it. In Bloomington, Indiana, where the city has adopted a new unified development ordinance, and their ordinance has basically done away with single-family zoning. So you can do between 1 and 3 units on
Oh, wow.
a lot, and all of these older single-family neighborhoods are freaking. I mean,
Oh.
it's like the big issue. So the problem is getting the right standard so
Right.
that.
No more single family.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, in my part of town, you couldn't fit it if you tried. And so
Yeah,
if you
that's right.
suggested doing it in the core where we have the density we do, I think people would be like, no, they can't fit more. But there are parts of town maybe where that could be absorbed better. You know what I mean?
So
Yeah,
we probably can't give you a calculation on that. I think it's a good policy discussion about what areas or what ideas might support that. And,
Okay.
and I think in the housing discussion, which is I think in January, it'd be a good time to probably dig into that a little bit further.
Okay, sounds good.
So that the corridor plan tried to bring it up
Yeah,
as an area where we felt it could be done without really intruding into the fabric of the neighborhood.
Right.
So I think we were trying to be sensitive to doing it without disrupting the neighborhood.
Right.
And that's tricky. Not all neighborhoods are going to work that way.
I definitely agree. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of potential
the
there.
other interesting issue that kind of densification raises is on-street parking. And the odd thing is that on-street parking is not necessarily that bad. I mean, it's traffic calming. It really slows, but we have all been trained to think that it's a terrible thing and that we can't allow it at all. So that a lot of these issues that are kind of traditional orthodoxies are getting rethought. So it's an interesting, but auxiliary dwelling units are definitely a part of the picture and are getting kind of increasingly talked about in different places.
My personal experience having in California by state law, you can't say no to them.
Huh.
So
Right.
my personal experience is they're not a panacea of affordable housing.
Sure.
There
I believe
are
that.
significant limits or appetite by individual property owners to want to do it.
Mhm.
So I think it's a small way of adding some housing to the community. I don't think it's
Not
not gonna
everybody's gonna leap at it,
change
yeah.
things.
Yeah, right.
Meaningfully in the market about creating a much larger supply.
Right.
So, in this land, in our comp plan, is it outside the realm of what we're trying to accomplish to look at some areas where there's been some constraints, like that area that has that overlay?
So
Or is that something which becomes more policy post comp plan because?
no, it's going to be in the comp plan. So you have in the LUPP land use designations that lock in these things. So when you get to the land use map, which is what most people think the whole plan is, you're going to set density ranges and types of uses. So so it's going to be when you adopt the plan. It's not going to be something else at a later date.
So it
I
will
mean,
be
it could be, but that means you're locking in status quo now, and you'll consider an amendment later.
I think that council would really appreciate hearing from public developers, people who have considered other areas and said, boy, we're handcuffed. We just can't do anything. This is the opportunity or time to really talk about that because that might free up some infill opportunities.
That's right, yeah.
That they would say, we're just salivating at it if we can do it, but we just can't do it because of how it's set up right now.
Right.
And when you think about how this is going to work for public outreach going forward, we're trying to get the structure of a plan from you on multiple topics, and then we have to do community outreach. We can't go into every neighborhood now and ask them, what do you think, before we create the plan. It's going to be, here's a version of the plan. How do you react to your neighborhood being this or that? and inviting people to now participate in in specific comments about things.
Which I was, with this question out earlier, is do we get, at what point are we going to be getting public input on even what this is right now? Is it be beneficial to
So I
there's
think
people that you would be using this almost every day to get their feedback? I'm not saying go out to all the neighborhoods, but I'm just wondering, the more community and public engagement would seem the better to try and get some litmus test, but maybe not. Maybe it's going to be.
so.
What's-
My feeling, and Corey and Marty might have way different experiences than me. The abstract is hard to get a reaction to. I feel like when we take this and apply it to a map, then people can say, I hate that, I love that. But what we showed you tonight, how do you know how that applies to your house or your street? I think it's always posted up and you could have, you could put it as an agenda item at a council meeting and let people come talk about it to receive input. We could host an open house. I just don't know until we make it tangible what it means to people.
Are you asking about these particular things, the principles, the vision, the philosophy?
I was not clear in my question.
So he's talking about the things we just went over today.
So I think,
Talking about the
Yeah.
specific site idea.
No.
Oh, yeah, okay.
yeah, I was thinking you meant this. So
I was not.
so I think-
clear. I was not clear in my question. I mean, yes, it was what Marty opened up.
Two
Yeah.
ways.
And the complete streets has already been adopted. So we're not
correct.
getting-
I don't want to I don't think we need to revisit that.
It's just, I think it might be helpful to say, how are you, what are you thinking? Because if we want to be collaborative and open, I wonder if that would be helpful.
Yeah, so
If I may.
Yeah.
Yeah. So oftentimes with the steering committee setting, it's just vetting all this stuff because truthfully, we've got probably one opportunity to capture their reaction. And so we want to make sure that we vet it through this group and then we're able to present that. And that might be in January. It could be February, but yeah, ultimately it needs to go back out, it needs to get some more public feedback, but, and that can be online, it can be during an event, but
I think we kind of need some guidance from you though. Do you want it as an open house with staff or are you trying to, at some point, what are your forums that people can come speak to you? I think that's the question that's really unanswered. We'll have events and stuff when the whole plans are put together, but if you want incremental input, do you want it in front of you in this room if people choose to do that at this point? And we would need to then put that on an agenda, on regular agendas as a chance to give comment. And we've kind of talked about it, but we haven't done that yet.
I don't know that putting it on an agenda gets you the broad spectrum of response. I think you get
Right.
the responses from the people who usually show
Show
up.
up.
And I personally would like us to have a much broader input from the community than what we typically get.
The more we get participation, it just breeds ownership, and also it's going to give us a document that I think that we can really execute on, and people are just really excited about. So, but I understand that it can also, I'm not trying to turn this into a design by committee, trying to, design a horse and you get a camel out of it. I understand it can also cloud the process, but boy, there's a lot of stuff here that's going to affect a lot of people, and we want we want to have something that, unlike what happened previously, that 6 months after it was adopted, it was already getting undone because it wasn't working. I think we'd all be happier if we have something we could really use, and people are saying they may not agree with everything, but at least they understand it, and it's really because there's a lot of brain power that would exist.
I think the way the tasks are set up right now, it would be highly focused on the public first draft for the major outreach initiatives. So you see a whole package together rather than here's a land use principle, but I can't tell what the housing principles are yet.
Yeah, I totally agree with
So
that.
that's where we're headed.
yeah.
And that means there's gonna be significant outreach, multiple opportunities to look at the whole plan and not just give staff input, but come to you
Yeah,
guys as well.
and there's some ideas that are I think interesting that involve putting together kind of a summary piece that gets distributed widely throughout the community. One of the most interesting things was the famous 1909 Chicago plan, one of the most famous probably the most famous planning document in American history, where the Commercial Club of Chicago actually printed coloring books that they gave to kids that's the plan that led to Grant Park and the Chicago Lakefront and so forth.
So for input in other direction, that's where we're headed right now. And we're always open to suggestions on what to do differently on the outreach.
Well, I think that I think you duly noted it, but the point is that we really need a lot of public input and engagement on this process. So we really get it right going through.
Right. So we're talking about preliminarily over 400 comments. I think Corey just said today, just talking about scenarios, which doesn't even deal with the existing city. You've had 300 individuals or 300 individual comments.
300 unique comments.
So
it's
there might be
about
multiple comments.
just shy of 100 individuals.
So 5 people, but so I think we are seeing the people that are interested are catching up with us. I can't remember what our email list is right now, so we always have an email blast about these meetings or when things are available. So this presentation tonight will be on the website tomorrow, and we'll let people know that's available. So we'll keep putting it there and letting people involved, but that big push is really the first draft.
You might want to make a correction to that one cover sheet on the,
Yeah, I got it. Vision
Good.
transportation. Yeah.
So I can pull that.
I agree, Gloria. I think that having an agenda and a meeting will be really not very productive. I think it's really staff or workshops, whatever process you go
Right,
through to get
right.
feedback, and also invite people to really pour through it and give comments back essentially.
Just a couple more comments. I think are we winding up?
Yep, we're on the last slide.
So this is very different than I thought it was going to be tonight. I was anticipating that we would be seeing some parts of town that are older ranch-style houses, that are perhaps an older housing stock that could easily be taken out and increase the density. I was worried about that because that represents a lot of our
Affordable housing.
affordable housing.
right.
That's right.
We have a lot of seniors that live in those houses. They have nowhere else comparable
Yeah,
to go.
I am pretty adverse to that.
And so I'm giving some feedback. I
Yeah.
really like what I saw
Yeah.
because as I was concerned early on about the concept of gentrification, there wasn't a single project there that really is going to be a case of heavy gentrification.
Right.
You easily could have wiped out several blocks and that housing we could never have found that kind of housing again.
That's right.
A second piece I just want to throw on the table.
I'm glad you said that.
No,
Yeah.
it's very impressive. We've been talking a lot about affordable housing. And
For years.
I want to think about, as we do these infill projects, to what degree are we intentional about affordable housing? And I don't have any suggestions right now, but I want to make that part of this ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Because we could easily do really cool, like the downtown Des Moines areas, and that's really cool, but that's not
It's
affordable.
not affordable.
And so as we have this kind of community conversation, I want to resist the temptation to do only cool high-end stuff and not recognize the value of some portion of affordable housing.
Yeah, we have, I mean, this is an enormous issue nationwide, and it's an enormous issue in our work as well. And right now, the sort of default that what I would characterize as progressive planners are thinking about are, number one, saying it's all about zoning, which is not true, but it's something that planners can kind of fiddle with, and it's only true where zoning ordinances don't allow higher density development or don't allow middle level kind of small lot single family, and there are a lot of those, but it's not, but just saying, well, if we fix the zoning ordinance, it'll fix everything is not an accurate statement. The other thing are inclusionary mandates. That is saying, if you want to build something, a certain percentage of the housing needs to be, quote, affordable or workforce. And that's something to consider. We have been, a lot of our work has been, how do we develop a structure rather of mandates of increasing incentives. So for example, if people are saying, well, in order to develop a subdivision, we need city partnership on infrastructure. We might be saying and have put together some structures for this. All right, fine, except that the level of partnership that we participate in increases with your ability to incorporate housing affordability into this. So that we'll give you something if you give us something, as opposed to saying you must develop certain percentage as quote affordable unquote housing.
So we're not going to solve this tonight, but I just want to make sure that
Yeah.
we have this on the agenda.
Yeah, that's a fundamental part of the
If I
housing
just jump in too,
component.
is that at the National League of Cities, we just came back from a couple weeks ago. I sat in a very interesting, seminar, and obviously this council has been very committed to affordable housing. We talked about it even when we went through and commissioned, the study. But boy, there's a lot of train wrecks in the United States on inclusionary zoning, and they just said they're unwinding those in places. They had some examples of 20% required inclusionary zoning, which is basically a disaster. So it was a lot of research needs to be done. If we're thinking about that, we got to really dig into that pretty deeply, because it just constrains.
Yeah, we
lot.
fall much more on the incentive side than on the mandate side.
Two real quick things, and I don't want to hold this up. I would be very interested to see suggestions on solar or some other kind of innovative way that we could build some sustainability as we do these projects, whether rooftop mounted solar or, so I'd like to think about that aspect as we do some of these. And I have a final one. We went to one of the programs at the NLC meeting that was probably the most beneficial for me was Gloria, what's the name of the fellow? Peter?
Kageyama.
Yeah, him. And
Author.
And so the takeaway is that we need to think about doing projects that are fun. So I want to do some really innovative things to do infill, but I know this is a very abstract concept. I want these to be fun. I want to build in a component, and like the example you had, like the boardwalk, sort of looking over.
Yeah,
I want to look at these things and go, we didn't just increase the density.
that's right.
We built something
That's
that
good.
is fun.
Yeah,
Wow.
And I'm just one person here, but I think there's some consensus on the council. Don't just build more units. Help us think about something that is going to be fun.
right.
So,
Yeah.
those are my thoughts.
Yeah, we are with you on that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree a lot with what Tim was saying, mainly in regards to when we're talking about housing and affordable housing. It's not just about increasing the supply, it's making meaningful supply. You can't just build another high rise like you have the Union, because students can't afford, especially in Campus Town, an $800 apartment a month for rent. And I think that the council really needs to be conscious if there are. I understand that we can't mandate anything that's built, but when we're talking about infill opportunities, if there is some way that we can incentivize the building of things that aren't necessarily these high-rise apartment complexes that are super state-of-the-art, brand new everything, that are just completely out of reach for so many. And I did like a lot of what I had to see tonight, so that's really cool.
There's been a really fine line of balancing incentivization and people saying, why are my tax dollars going to help pay or buy down? I mean, it's a policy issue, and I understand where you're coming from. And, by the way, council didn't tell the developers to build $800 a month, bedroom units. That was a choice that the developers made because that's what they felt the market.
Get it, right.
The market and students are paying for it. It's not that, hey, you should build that. I think that's a misunderstanding at times. All we do is approve what you can do on the property. The developer decides what he's going to build, and they're going to try and maximize their investment as well too. But
I think it's a really good point, Devin, really good point. But I think it's a big policy issue because it involves tax dollars.
So just a side note to what you were saying, John, about inclusionary zoning at the NLC. The session I was in actually had 2 stories of very successful inclusionary practices in St. Louis Park and Burnsville, Bloomington, Minnesota. And I'm getting more information on that. And those combine incentives with the,
It could be the other one, which is basically strictly the stick, and you had a carrot and a stick both. And
Yeah, everything seems to work better in Minnesota, so,
Minnesota nice.
yeah.
It's like Iowa nice.
So besides the incentives, what are you seeing? What's happening? How do you unpack and deal with the affordable housing?
Oh, let's. Right now?
Can you go to the last slide?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
that's a big topic.
because that'll tell you when we're going to do it.
So in January?
I think a lot of the things that we heard about neighborhoods and housing, that's the meaty topic. In January, there's 2 big ones, the future land use map, and then those categories of use that go with that future land use map, but then what are the specifics about what you allow where and how? So that's coming up. We're not going to promise you a perfect answer to affordable housing.
No.
That doesn't exist. But yes, we need to go through it. We understand what the limits are and where you want to have direction on policy.
Well, I just think that given the fact that RDG does this all over the place, and this is your area of expertise,
Yeah.
and you see this going on, I would love to hear, I was just teasing Brian, well, you don't want to stay 2 more hours tonight? But I just think this is a big issue that we've been talking about for a long time. It's a high priority of the council. And I just would love to hear what you're seeing as successful, and let to hear what Gloria, what you found, and I'll dig up what I had found too.
And the basic problem is that it doesn't just happen. There has to be, the places that have been able to accomplish it, and, you never meet the full need, but have put aside money to help. I mean, it's really a combination of incentives, of risk abatement, of in some cases subsidy or write-downs or participation with potential owners. I mean, it all involves, it doesn't work when it's simply a mandate on developers, I don't think.
And the hardest part is, I think we said this is not unique to Ames. It's not unique to college towns.
No.
It is the housing market of the country.
It's a national issue.
It's a
It's the
national
housing market of the country. So, so just looking forward, December 19th, mentioned that a few times, huge step. That's going to be very important. We want to move on from that. I think RDG is chomping at the bit to get into the other components of it. It's going to feed into the future land use map. If you endorse what we put forward as an option, that helps us put the future land use map together. Very, very significant. If there's work to still be done after the 19th, that'll affect whether we can finish the land use map for January. Housing and neighborhoods, that's all going to kind of go together. The sub areas, we are not necessarily going to have any more detail in these infill drawings that RDG presented tonight, but that's kind of lumped in there with the neighborhoods so that we talk about what are areas that are worth highlighting as that. And then we can move into these other topics that we talked about. So is there any questions right now? You will be getting an email from Diane, which means you need to check your calendars in January, towards the end of January, for another special meeting. Your workshop is for January is already the capital improvements program. So we will need another meeting date because you are already full. Yes, there are a lot of
There's a lot of meetings.
Yes, January is
A lot of
hard.
meetings in February.
Yep. So pending schedules, that's the plan. Diane will be reaching out to you and we will have to see what we can do. We're looking at the end of the month. It won't be in the beginning of the month because we can't react from the 19th quickly.
I just want to emphasize one more time something that I've been saying throughout this process, and that is I don't know that our outreach is reaching the underrepresented populations in this community. And especially when I see culture, community character, health, and equity, I'm thinking, who can talk better about equity than people who perhaps have not experienced equity? And so I want us to be thinking creatively about ways to get input using tools other than making people show up for meetings or workshops that are only occur for a particular amount of time, pop-ups in grocery stores or something.
Yeah, those are a good idea. I mean, they do work. We have done sessions where we this was in Shawnee, Oklahoma, where we just stayed in a there was kind of a combination food bank and grocery store kind of thing that and we just did all of our work there for one day.
And it could be, you may have to say, we do it on a Saturday and you provide childcare.
Yeah.
So people who just can't get to a meeting on an evening, are thinking outside the box to try and really reach those, like Lori just mentioned, I think it'd be really important.
Yeah.
So the community really has an opportunity to be engaged, so. Anything else yes, go ahead. Anything else?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for all the time that you guys have been putting into this. And also, I just want to thank the staff because you identified that you're working on all these concurrent projects and thinking about holding up this process a little bit so those other projects can catch up and we can leverage the information that's coming out of that. And so just being able to see that and being able to leverage that information, I think this will probably be, at least for the comprehensive plans that I've worked on, one of the more informed land use plans that I've been involved with. So I think that it's a very exciting possibility.
We really love this working arrangement, by the way. This just works so well. So we appreciate your flexibility in doing it this way.
What do you mean, the setup here?
The setup here, and the sort of exchange that this produces is a really good thing.
Anything else did you guys the three of you want to
For us, just a couple logistics for the 19th. One of the deliverables you wanted from us way back, I think Chris kind of brought this up, was can you give us some thoughts about how to think about scenarios? So we will be sending you a memo. It's not a scoring system, but it's the kind of things that are in our consciousness that you may or may not value as you look at the scenarios. But that's kind of before you actually get the information. Because you have a council meeting on the 17th, you have a packet coming on that Friday. We are going to give you the materials for the 19th on the 17th. So we're not going to try to combine the regular meeting content with the meeting for the 19th. So you will get it a couple of days in advance. You won't just see it cold like this. And that's the plan, to try to manage the workload for everybody here in the next 2 weeks. Any other questions about any of that stuff right now?
Good. Well, thank you.
Okay. Moving on to council comments. All right, Devin, any comments tonight?
Nah, I'm good.
All right, David?
No, sir.
Nope, none for me.
Gloria?
No.
Amber?
No.
Chris?
Nope.
Thanks for your good work. This has been very interesting tonight.
Yeah, thanks. Good.
Just a reminder for council, we have on Friday, we have the joint meeting with Mary Gray Medical Center. That's at 9:30. There's also, as we talked about last time, they have the Malcolm Aldridge Award. And there's a ceremony at 8 o'clock. They're going to have an assembly, and you're invited to come. But it's a great celebration. So, and obviously we have a council meeting next Tuesday night as well. And disposition communications, the only we got was that one letter, I think that was in our non-agenda, was a notification from MediaCom.
Yeah.
I just haven't sent it to you because it was sent for information, so anyway. All right.
Good. Thank you.
All right, we need a motion to adjourn?
To adjourn.
We are adjourned, thank you.
Thank you again for joining.